towards the very end of summer and even into autumn here in California, there are tons of heirloom tomatoes still on the market. And especially if you're growing them in your backyard, you may have copious amounts and you want to preserve all of that great tomato flavor of summer so you can enjoy it throughout the winter. So I'm going to show you how to make my friend Elizabeth Jardina's improvisational tomato sauce. And it's really meant to be used with heirloom tomatoes that are very, very ripe. This one here is almost like a water balloon. I can just feel it squishing, which is perfect for this kind of sauce. Don't use store-bought, hard, refrigerated tomatoes. It's really good to use these really fresh heirlooms for this particular sauce recipe, because what it's going to end up being is a very thick, very intense, almost tomato paste-like sauce that you could use as a pizza sauce. You could thin with a little more wine for a tomato sauce on pasta. It's incredibly versatile and you can keep it in the freezer forever. Well, maybe not forever, but for a long time. And I'm going to show you how to make it today. So thank you, Elizabeth and Brian. This one's for you. And it's called improvisational tomato sauce because you can really play with the seasonings and the herbs and whatever you want to use. But the basic recipe is to start with 2 pounds of heirloom tomatoes that are very ripe. And 2 pounds of tomatoes is not that much. Heirlooms are very heavy, so it turns out that these 3 tomatoes together are actually 2 pounds. And you want to start out by very coarsely chopping them. And the nice thing about this sauce is that it doesn't require a lot of peeling and de-seeding. You're really going to use every part of the tomato in this. And some people may not like that. You may really want to blanch your tomatoes, peel them, de-seed them. But this is a very rustic sauce, and it really is not very wasteful, which is something that I really like. So really coarsely sort of chunk up all of your tomatoes. You're also going to need to mince up 2 cloves of garlic for this recipe. So if you want to see a no-stick garlic trick, go ahead and watch my other video called No Stick Garlic. It'll show you how to keep it from sticking to the board and your fingers and your knife. It's just a pinch of salt. I've got my 2 pounds of heirloom tomatoes chopped up. The mixture should be really juicy. These are really ripe tomatoes, so there's lots of juice in there. Don't worry about it. They still have seeds. They still have skins. I promise you it'll be okay, but you can feel free to de-seed and de-skin if you don't want it. I'm going to heat up my Dutch oven over medium-high heat. I'm going to let it go for a second, and I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. And the whole point of this sauce is to get the tomatoes really caramelized and really deeply, intensely reduced in flavor. I'm going to scrape in our 2 cloves of garlic. You can hear it sizzle just a little bit. That's a good thing. And stir it around in the olive oil for just a little bit. You just want the garlic to start releasing some flavor into the oil. We're not going to brown it. You don't really want to brown it at all. But once you get that nice garlicky aroma in there, it's time to throw in your tomatoes. Scrape in your 2 pounds of tomatoes, juice and all. Stir it around. And then stir around a little bit more, and then throw in some seasoning. I'm using a 1.5 teaspoons of thyme. You could use a 1.5 teaspoons of oregano. You can use whatever herbs you really like. Fresh basil would work fine in this as well. You're going to want to use more. You're going to want to use maybe a handful of the leaves chopped up. But for this particular sauce, I actually kind of like thyme. It gives it sort of a little more versatility. So you can add some fresh basil. If you have this in the freezer, you can add some fresh basil to it just before you're serving it and give it a certain flavor. But the thyme could make it go in sort of a French style flavor also, so it doesn't just have to be an Italian flavored sauce. You can make it more versatile by choosing different sorts of herbs. So sprinkling in all of that thyme and stirring around. And now what I'm going to do, which might be a little bit surprising, is I'm going to crank up the heat a little bit. I'm going to bring it up to high, and I'm going to let it start boiling off some of the water in those tomatoes and start reducing down and really concentrating that tomato flavor. So this is going to take a little bit of time. You're going to want to watch it, but you can wander around the kitchen, do other things, wash some dishes, hang out, have a snack while this starts going. Alright, now that my tomatoes have come to a boil, I'm just going to season them a little bit. You want to start seasoning things midway through cooking so you can build up and build layers of flavor. So I'm going to add about 1/2 to 3/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt. Actually, maybe a little bit more, maybe a full teaspoon. and several grinds of black pepper just for good measure. There's lots of steam coming up. It's bubbling away like crazy. You're not going to end up with a really high yield of sauce, but it's going to be so intense that you won't care. So just let it keep going, and eventually the pan's going to start drying up, and you're going to start seeing some caramelization on the bottom. It's going to look like the tomatoes are sticking. Just keep checking it, keep stirring it every once in a while, and then we're going to deglaze it in a little bit with a few tablespoons of wine. Going to scrape up all of that caramelization, and then we're going to put it in freezer bags, and it's going to be great in December. Okay, my tomatoes were really boiling. I reduced the heat just a little bit, so it's now on sort of medium-low because it's really losing a lot of liquid and it's starting to get very thick. It's starting to smell a little bit caramelized, and it's starting to get a little bit brown on the bottom of the pan, and that's what you want. So don't worry, browning on the bottom of the pan is good. Black and charred on the bottom of the pan, bad. But a dark, rich brown, a-okay. So I'm just stirring it a little bit. It still has a little bit of liquid left in it, but you really want to let this go until you're alarmed that it might burn. You really want to take it to the edge. And if you're real nervous about it and it smells burned, it's burned. But if it's not quite burned yet and it just has this tomatoey, caramelized, sort of sharp, acidic smell still, you're doing just fine. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like a paste, which is exactly what you want. And afterwards, after you take this off the heat, you can actually puree it in a blender if you want a really smooth sauce. But I find the tomatoes break down so well that I don't really feel that there's a need to do it. So when you're actually sort of worried that it's going to burn, it's time to add some wine. And we're going to add 2 to 3 tablespoons of wine, and you want to use, I'm using a red wine, and you want to use one that's a little bit low in tannin, so a light Zinfandel, a Côtes du Rhône, a Pinot Noir, not something real syrupy and thick, not something super tannic like a Cabernet Sauvignon. You don't want that. You want something kind of medium-bodied, kind of light. And it makes a lovely sizzle when you do this, and it's also going to help you scrape up all of those lovely caramelized tomatoey bits on the bottom. And I'll be good and I'll measure right now, so we'll start with 1, okay, that's a little more than 1, 2, and we'll see how that goes. If we need a little bit more liquid to scrape all of this up, then we'll use a 3rd. And this adds even more color and depth and richness to the sauce. And you don't want to leave it on too long. It does take a while for alcohol to cook off in this, so if you really want to cook off the alcohol, you may want to add the wine a little bit earlier and then really cook it down and not deglaze, or deglaze with a tiny bit of water. You can avoid, if you don't want to use wine at all, you can absolutely add a little bit of water at the very end and that will be fine. But I love the flavor that wine adds to this, and I think it's, if you like to cook with wine, I highly recommend it. And I'm scraping it up, and it's time to turn off the heat and remove this from the heat, because you don't want to leave it with that residual heat because we're already down to sort of a low liquid part, so you don't want it to get all sticky and stuck to the bottom because we just deglazed. And when this cools, you can go ahead and just scoop it into freezer bags. You can use it right away, of course. Obviously, feel free to do that. But if you have a lot of tomatoes, you may want to store some in the freezer for the winter. And I like to scoop it in 1-cup portions into little sandwich bags, so you don't have to defrost a giant gallon-sized bag of tomato sauce to use, for one pizza. So thank you to Elizabeth and Brian for your improvisational tomato sauce. Feel free to improvise yourself, add different herbs and spices, and enjoy.